Here we get Pennonia Lilac. Now, this is a very light pastel purple. It looks a bit darker in the swatch than it does in the writing sample, just a little bit. There is a bunch of tone shift as paper changes, and clearly for the better. It does shade. On non-fountain pen friendly paper, there is great news, sort of. It performs just as well as it does on premium papers. Now, this is completely not for me as a kind of ink, but there is a purple that, or there is people that will love this. So let's give it, a fair look that it deserves.
The pen for today is a Retro 51 Tornado. And now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's see how I got there by looking at the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine.
Here we see that very light lilac on the page, and perhaps as a result of this being very bright white Clairfontaine paper. This is much too light for me as a tone. It doesn't feather, it doesn't spread, it does shade extremely well. It's just the tone on this paper that is 100% not me. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
Pennonia makes more than just one ink. Let's take a look at a few other inks from Pennonia.
Here is Pennonia Almazoid Green Apple. Here is Pennonia Storm Cloud. Here is Pennonia Bubblegum.
The second writing sample is done in a Portage Reporter notebook.
Here we can see that the tone is a little lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. Really an unfortunate thing for this ink. It gets to be quite difficult to read. Now, it doesn't feather, doesn't spread, barely shades, barely is readable to me. Looking at the back of the page, no bleeding and no ghosting.
There's a lot to be learned by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is done the way it's supposed to be done. A line of ink is put down to immediately put into water to show the separation of those colors making the ink. Now the one on the right is marked with a D. This is allowed to dry for 10 minutes before it's put into water. The third writing sample is done in a national brand Steno notebook.
Here we see that the tone is lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. Now, while it is lighter, I find it easier to read on this paper than it was on the bright white paper. Now, the lighter tone, I don't believe, is an effect from the tone of the paper. I see it more as it's non-fountain pen friendly paper, and that we're going to see a little bit of lightening for. It's not a big deal. It doesn't feather, doesn't spread. It does have some shading, I suppose. If you look at suppose, the S is a little darker, you could call it, than the U. It darkens a little at the PP. The OS gets very light. The E at the end gets to be some of the darker at the bottom. But compare that to the print writing underneath, where X is not contained in B. That looks, in general, much darker than the word suppose. Looking at the back of the page, no bleeding and no ghosting.
Resistance tests are done to see how well this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. Now, the smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. In the upper left, you can see where there is highlighter. In the upper right, that is pen flush. The lower left has a 1/3 bleach solution, and the lower right has plain old water. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook.
Here we get the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather, does not spread, shades just a little bit less than it did on the Clairfontaine. It is very hard to read because of the quad rule. Really, it melts into the background, bringing the quad rule forward and more to our attention, making this not a good ink to use if this is the paper that you go for. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at a few more violet or purple inks.
Here is Noodler's Tchaikovsky. Here is Pilot Yamabudo or Crimson Glory Vine.
Here is Robert Oster Pygmy Purple. Here is Sailor Studio 373.
All of the inks that you just saw have a review here on the channel. Now, the next writing sample is done in a Composition Lab notebook.
Here we see the tone is a bit lighter, a bit flatter than it was on the Clairfontaine. Normal effect of this paper. It doesn't feather, doesn't spread, it does shade, doesn't stand out against the quad rule, is incredibly hard to read. I mean, We can now return. End of the fourth line, almost unreadable. Therefore, wow, just wow. Just wow. Hard to read. If you're a student using this, stop it. This is absolutely a horrible ink for you to be using in any kind of notes that you want to be able to look back at. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting. Not that it's a surprise with this ink.
While it's nice to see inks that are in the same color family, I prefer to find inks that complement the color on the page.
Here is Diamine Emerald. Here is Organic Studios Arsenic Gray. Here is Geherbon Rose Cyclamon. Here is Van Diemen Hasting Caves Shimmering Ink.
The best way you can support this or any channel that you like watching is to alert the retailer of where you saw the product at time of purchase. Now, the last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper.
Here we see the tone is just a little bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. Doesn't feather. Does have a little bit of spread. Not really a problem considering how light it is. It does have a little bit of shading. Again, it's not even going to matter. It's so light, it's practically unusable and should probably be avoided on most every paper. Looking at the back of the page, not that this would really be a surprise, but there's no bleeding, no ghosting. I guess if you didn't want to be able to read what's on either side, you could write on both sides of the page with this ink.
So what nib and pen do I think are going to give the best writing experience with this ink?
The Retro 51 stub is a medium flow pen that gives a very, very light pastel with, I guess, a nice seasoning of shading. Now off camera, I tried this in a wet medium and the tone darkened a lot and became much more usable. It still also shaded. Now, I'm going to say much more usable. I'm not going to say desirable at that point. So I think our end here is obvious, though, that we need a wetter pen. The wetter, the better, and probably a gusher of a fine.